So far in this unit, we have learned how to break down an argument into its essential parts and identify and explain the weaknesses found in those arguments. In this lesson, you will develop your rebuttal and refutation skills by practicing a series of counterargument techniques. A counterargument is just an argument made against another argument. And this is done through using rebuttal and refutation. Counterarguments are made by addressing either actual arguments that have been made or by preemptively addressing potential arguments that could be made. An effective counterargument will do three things. Begin by accurately relating the opposing argument's claim and evidence, and sometimes the assumption if the flaw is in the assumption. It will then identify where the opposing argument is weak, and finally explain the weakness. Today's exercises will walk you through a series of 10 different counterargument techniques. And this is what each technique looks like. This is how you're introduced to each one. At the top of the page, you'll see the part of the exercise that you're working on. You'll begin with part 1, which is all about techniques used to counter evidence. And then part 2 is techniques used to counter assumptions. Beneath that on the page, you'll see the number of the technique. This is technique number 1, and its name, correcting a common misconception. Beneath the name, you're first given an explanation of the flaw that's contained within the weak argument. Then some simple instructions on how to counter that kind of an argument. Then beneath the flaw, you're given an example of that weak argument. And next to it, an example of how you could counter that particular argument. Beneath all the explanations and examples, you're given an exercise to try, where you are asked to write a counterargument paragraph like the one in the example, which refutes the argument using the technique described above. And then beneath that, you're given a sample weak argument to write that counterargument paragraph on. Some of these techniques will contain a link to do some extra reading on the topic, just so you can be better informed when you write your counter argument. And you're just going to be responding to these in your notes document like usual. The link to all of the different counter argument techniques is in a PDF. Write the name of the technique in the technique column. And then write your counter argument to that weak argument in the counter argument paragraph column. It's time to pause this video to complete the first part of the practice activity. Complete part A, which asks you to practice writing counter-argument paragraphs that respond to a series of common flawed arguments. And each of the flawed arguments here will feature a problem with the evidence statements. When you're finished with part A, go ahead and unpause the video so that we can go over some sample responses together. There are, of course, a lot of different ways that you could write these, but I want to mimic my models as much as possible. So here's how I responded to number 1. The writer argues that vaccines are unhealthy because they contain toxic chemicals, specifically formaldehyde. The toxicity of vaccines is a misconception, however. While chemicals like formaldehyde, mercury, and aluminum are present in vaccines, according to the FDA, they are present in such small amounts that they are not harmful. In fact, the FDA and CDC have both concluded that formaldehyde in particular is produced at higher rates by our own bodies naturally than the amounts we receive through vaccines. Number 2, here's what I did for that one. The writer claims that Muslims should not be allowed to enter the United States and cites the terror attacks that have been committed by Muslims in recent years as evidence. The evidence here, however, is cherry-picked, as only a handful of Muslims are responsible for those attacks out of the 1.8 billion Muslims in the world. In fact, way more terror attacks have been committed in the U.S. by right-wing domestic terrorists who are predominantly Christian than by Islamic extremists entering the country. And here's number 3. The writer argues that students should be limited in their access to internet-connected devices because they need to become better critical and creative thinkers. However, having greater access to the internet could also help accomplish this goal. The internet is not inherently harmful to a student's intellectual growth. It can be used by teachers and students to send and retrieve a wider variety of information way faster than we could without it, which opens doors to a greater number of learning opportunities than students might have if they were denied access. Number 4, the writer argues that guns must be made easier to purchase because, according to the NRA, the lives of dozens of Americans are saved each year by private citizens who have guns. However, it should be noted that this evidence comes from a group whose primary goal and source of income is to increase gun sales. The NRA monetarily benefits from more people having guns, so it stands to reason that they would make any argument, whether true or not, that would help them sell more guns. And finally, number 5, the writer claims that Duterte's war on drugs has been successful because almost 9,000 drug dealers, quote, have been taken off the streets. However, the writer fails to mention that, according to the same article, these people have been taken off the streets by means of extrajudicial killings. Duterte's campaign against drugs allows police officers and civilians to kill suspected drug dealers on sight for cash rewards. Without due process, this horrific bounty system has led to the deaths of countless innocent people. Pause the video again, this time to complete part B of the practice activity, which asks you to practice writing counterargument paragraphs responding to another series of common flawed arguments. This time the arguments all have flaws in their assumptions. When you're finished with part B, go ahead and unpause the video so we can go over some sample responses together. Here's number 6. The writer claims that the 1942 World War II film Casablanca is dull or uninteresting because it doesn't contain any battles or aerial dogfights. The assumption here is that a film about war is only interesting if it contains battles or aerial dogfights. But judging the movie on these terms is unfair. Films about wars don't have to contain large-scale extended action sequences to be interesting. Casablanca is celebrated for its rich character study, artistic cinematography, and subtle commentary on American isolationism prior to its entry on the war. These elements are all interesting to many people. Number 7, the writer argues that man-made climate change is not real because the president says it is not real. The assumption here is that the president is an authority on climate, which is just not true. While the president is an authority on matters of state and domestic policy, usually, he is not a climate scientist, nor has he been known to do any reasonable amount of research on the subject. Number 8, the writer claims that people should invest in a university education because wealthier people tend to have more university education than poorer people. The assumption here is that a university education, in part, has helped wealthy people earn their wealth. However, this could be mistaking cause for effect. The correlation between wealth and higher education levels may be true, but perhaps wealthy people are more likely to have a university education because they're better able to afford one in the first place. We would need further evidence to prove which causes which. Number 9, the writer argues that more CEOs ought to be elected to public office since they have had such great success leading profitable companies. The assumption here is that success in public office requires the same skills as success in business, but the two jobs are completely different. Running a company requires maximizing profits for the company's shareholders at the expense of workers and consumers at large. Holding public office requires doing the most good for the most people, which means making decisions that are the most equitable for everyone, not just a small group like the shareholders in the company example. And finally, number 10, The writer argues that laws should not be enacted to restrict access to guns because no law would ever prevent every person who wants to use them to commit violent crime from obtaining a gun. The assumption here is that laws should only be enacted if they can entirely prevent something harmful from happening, which is ridiculous. If our society operated under that rule, we would have no traffic laws, no environmental laws, no laws whatsoever. The purpose of laws are not to completely eliminate certain behaviors in citizens. Doing that is impossible. Laws exist to deter people from certain behaviors and serve as statements of society's values. Laws restricting access to guns would do no more to completely eliminate gun crimes than laws against mail fraud have completely eliminated mail fraud. However, if we decided that because some people still commit mail fraud, we should just stop prosecuting it altogether, we would see a lot more mail fraud happen in our country. And to close out this lesson, go ahead and complete Part C, which asks you to practice your counterargument skills on flawed arguments in the wild. Once you've finished Part C, you're finished with this lesson.